Hi, this is Braschek, and welcome to our occasional podcast. This one we just had to do. Stumbled on this book. I can't even remember how, but I'm so glad I did. A fascinating book, and it raised so many issues. The name of the book, before we talk any further, is How the Irish Won the American Revolution, which may sound like a wild-eyed idea, but when we get into it, we're going to see that there is absolutely a lot of factual basis for that. We're also going to ask the question of why we didn't know this before, and we're going to talk to a fascinating historian who is prolific and sees around the corner and writes about a lot of things that other people are not paying attention to. So I'd like to welcome you, everybody, to Philip Thomas Tucker. Philip, hi.
Hello, how are you, Ken? Thank you for your kind words, and I'm certainly delighted that you like the work, and it was certainly fun to do and quite a challenge. It's been quite a few years now. The book came out in 2015, God, it's like a million years ago, but it's entitled How the Irish Won the American Revolution, a new look at the forgotten heroes of America's War of Independence. And like you pointed out and mentioned, which I thank you for, the Irish in the American Revolution played a key role from beginning to end, and unfortunately this has been largely forgotten for quite a few reasons. But you see the Irish are just prominent, not only in the American Revolution, but also in the settlement of America. Even before the Revolution, there was like 4 major tides of immigration from Ireland, primarily Northern Ireland. And there was hundreds of thousands of Scotch-Irish that came to America even before the Revolution. This was timely for when the American Revolution broke out, of course, in April 1775. America had already a hardcore reserve, if you will, of individuals who were independence-minded and fiercely independent and individualistic, and they already had a hatred for the British and the British Empire. So these people made, the Scotch-Irish made ideal revolutionaries from the beginning to end, and in one theater after another, and in one state after another, or colony, it's always the Scotch-Irish that are leading the way in not only agitating for revolution, but also in the war effort in general.
And they were also handy with firearms, and were they were by de facto seasoned combat fighters because they had to fight to survive on the frontier.
Yes, yeah, that's a good point. Again, interestingly, the reason why they were forced to the frontier out of absolute necessity was because, of course, they were mainly lower class or middle class Irish, and they were lacking in means. Most had been like tenant farmers in Northern Ireland, and they had been forced off their lands that they rented from the large English and Anglo-Irish landowners because they rightly conceived of the idea that they could make more money with raising livestock and sheep or importing to England for higher profits than having the Irish farm the land. So when they came to America, they were forced to the fringes of the frontier, and also some of the colonies, such as Pennsylvania, deliberately recruited the Scotch-Irish because they were so well known for their war-fighting ways and fiery temperaments that they served as an ideal buffer for the East Coast elite to keep the Indians at bay, or the Native Americans, shall we say, at bay. So they were certainly expendable, and they were ideal for to settle the frontier because they became well-versed in firearms, especially the long rifle. And like I said, by the time of the Revolution, America already had this die-hard core of individuals, the Scotch-Irish, who were more than ready to take on the British, or in large part to settle a lot of old scores that went back not only in their lives back to Ireland, but generations and generations before, because the Celtic people across Western Europe had always battled against the British Empire. Of course, England's first colony was Ireland, and it was a brutal conquest, and of course, it also conquered the other Celtic region of Wales and, of course, Scotland. And we all know about William Wallace and other freedom fighters who were fighting for Scottish liberty, and they also fought, of course, for the liberty of Wales and Scotland and Ireland. And, there's just one rebellion after another for hundreds of years with Celtic people rising up. And in this sense, that historical view puts the overall role of the Scotch-Irish and other Celtic people like the Welsh in a proper historical perspective, because by them leading the way in the American Revolution, basically for them that was just continuing their own rebellions back in the Celtic homeland, not only themselves but also their ancestors going back for hundreds of years. And so there's a continuum there, and in that respect, America was most fortunate to have so many Celtic people who were mainly Scotch-Irish who occupied the frontier by the time of the American Revolution. I think one of the best.
Let's talk about some of the practical manifestations of that. So, contemporary reports by the British themselves and other people. There are reports where when they would capture prisoners of war, they were shocked at how many of the prisoners they captured were Gaelic speaking. Can you talk about that? So let's start by talking about the actual combat troops.
Yeah, that's an excellent point. And because there has been historically a lot of anti-Irish sentiment in the U.S., in the past, American historians have not really given the Irish their due, and that's one of the primary reason, of course, why their role is forgotten. And you made a great point, because one of the best ways to early see and understand the predominance of the Irish role, especially the Scotch-Irish, but also other Celtic people like the Welsh, you can see from the words of not only British soldiers but also Hessian soldiers from Germany when they met so many Scotch-Irish on the battlefield, and especially when they captured American prisoners. They were just amazed because some of the prisoners could hardly speak English. They were speaking Gaelic, of course, the ancient language of Ireland. For example, there's one great quote from a Hessian captain, quote-unquote, who said, and this is to a friend in a letter, in summarizing the American Revolution, he said, quote-unquote, "Call it not an American rebellion, because it is nothing more or less than a Scotch-Irish Presbyterian rebellion." And
how do you like
that's
wow.
extremely significant. Of course, the Scotch-Irish, they were Presbyterians, almost all, but of course some were Methodist, Baptist. But there lies also the root of their antagonism with the British Empire, not only in terms of taking away their freedom movements when they were trying to free their homelands and establish their own independence across the Celtic nation, but also they were fighting against the Britain's Anglican Church, which was, of course, the main church of England, and the Presbyterians were considered dissenters, and for good reasons. They were heavily taxed by the Anglican Church, and they were basically persecuted not only by the British government but also the Anglican Church. But you can early see the key of the Irish role is like in the very beginning, Americans' very first invasion when in 1775 it was decided by the young Continental Congress to invade Canada. And leading the invasion was Richard Montgomery. He was a former British officer, and he led the invasion. He was born in North Ireland, and he was killed during the attack on Quebec. It was the last day of December 1775. And he was really America's very first war hero. and he came very close to capturing him and his men. He didn't have enough troops, of course, and he came close to capturing the city of Quebec, and it was in the middle of a snowstorm, and he had too few troops, but his effort was rather remarkable, and they almost gained, what Americans at that time wanted to become the 14th colony, which they believed would be the case if they could capture Canada, and it would fall in their hands. He's been relatively forgotten, Richard Montgomery. It's kind of an irony because we have today, there's probably more counties in every state named after him, Montgomery, and also cities like the capital of Alabama, Montgomery, Alabama. And he was known to Americans, when they settled these areas. But of course, today he's been forgotten, and he's a representative, very good example of the key roles played by the Irish and how they've been forgotten. Interestingly, I'm also working on a book, just finished, matter of fact, about the story of Kings Mountain, and it was a key battle, October 7th, 1781, in northwest South Carolina. It came at a time when American fortunes were disastrous after the fall of Charleston, South Carolina, the main port city in the South, in May 1780, and then after the disastrous Battle of Camden in August 1780, two American armies were completely wiped out. And it was left up to mainly the Scotch-Irish from, they call it the back country, on the east side of the Appalachian Mountains, and also the Scotch-Irish on the west side of the mountains, which were called the Over-Mountain region, and they were considered the Over-Mountain Men. At a time when America had no armies in South Carolina, and at a time when it looked like Britain was about to win it all, they had a plan to advance. Lord Cornwallis had a plan to advance from South Carolina into North Carolina, then into Virginia and beyond, with the plan of his superior, Sir Henry Clinton, advancing south from New York City to catch Washington's army right in the middle and in the war. Anyway, it was a crucial situation by the early fall of 1780, and almost by a miracle, the mainly Scotch-Irish of western North Carolina and a few Georgians and what is today East Tennessee banded together their own army. They didn't have supplies. They didn't even have a leader designated by Congress, and nobody told them to form an army, not the Congress, not Washington, George Washington, or anybody else. And they formed this army of over 1,000 men and eliminated a major threat in Patrick Ferguson and his loyalist command of over 1,000 men at Kings Mountain. So it's a real turning point of the American Revolution, and partly led the way to the most decisive victory of the war, of course, at Yorktown, Virginia, in October 1781, barely a year later. And again,
gotcha. So that's an unheralded success. I don't think that's taught in school. I think you're the first person.
Yes, sir. Yeah, that's an excellent point, because it's one of the most forgotten battles of American Revolution, but ironically, it's one of the most important ones, and it literally turned the tide of the war. And this was a time when Washington and his army were doing nothing. It was basically a stalemate, and that's why the British were focused on the South, because they realized they could win it all there. One of the main reasons why it's been so forgotten was, of course, at the time it wasn't forgotten, and many years later, but that all changed with the Civil War, of course, and all of a sudden, Southerners, of course, became great traders, and, Northern writers, they stopped writing about Southern history, including this important battle at Kings Mountain, which was fought in northwest South Carolina. So
a lot of what we're presented as history has really been filtered by some kind of ideology. So if Southerners were in disfavor, then the official history books were not going to talk about Southern heroism during the Revolutionary War.
Yeah, exactly. Because of what their ancestors did, 1861, 1865, they were tarred with that stain, and therefore, Northern writers that who've always dominated the history market, especially in the Northeast, the subject of Kings Mountain never became of much interest. But
I also noticed that even contemporary stories, which aren't really history yet. When does history start, by the way? Is it like an antique? I think antiques have to be 50 years old before you can call it an antique. When do we?
It could be. That's a good point. It mainly comes to the bottom line that the winners write history, the old cliche. It applies, and even, of course, to this example about the obscurity of Kings Mountain. Again, of course, the North won the Civil War, so therefore, Northern writers were not going to write about the losers and a Southern victory, which occurred on October 7th, 1781. So,
but it extends even to things that may not have any, seemingly not have any ideological filter, but maybe they do. Maybe it's not apparent. So I'll give you an example, and this is a story that we commemorate every year. On 9/11 in New York City, a little realized fact is that Manhattan actually really is an island. It's not just language. It is an island surrounded on water by all sides. And one of the things that happened is that all the bridges and tunnels were closed. So how did you get 1 million people, give or take a few 100,000, off Manhattan Island and back home to New Jersey, Connecticut, Brooklyn, the Bronx, Queens? Well, Queens, I guess they could walk. How did that happen? Well, that happened because of a spontaneous flotilla, armada, of working boats, tugboats, barge boats, ferry boats, pleasure craft, that spontaneously sailed right into the smoke and chaos and started taking people off the island and bringing them to where they needed to go. And it was not a government operation. All the Coast Guard did was say, yes, you are allowed to do it. That was really all they did. And all these boat owners, I think there's only one company that didn't participate. Every single company in that harbor was ferrying people all day and night at their own expense, of course. And that's been completely written out of the history. Right. And given how important the 9/11 story seems to be, it's amazing that great act of real heroism is ignored. And I can't help but suspect that because no official institution can take credit for it, it therefore didn't happen. And I'm wondering if that's not part of what's going on too. For instance, with this operation down in that you're writing the book on.
Yeah, that you made a very good point. That's exactly the case with Kings Mountain. It was again that this. I call it a ghost army. I call it a ghost army in a book, and it's formed mostly by just common individuals, common people, common settlers on the frontier who are mostly Scotch-Irish, and they basically just did this on their own. They didn't have the consent of or orders from the Continental Congress or Washington or anybody else. And they just did whatever they knew that had to be done, which was in this case was to eliminate the threat of Ferguson's loyalist force. But the key to it, and you pointed that out, and that was a brilliant observation on your part, that it sometimes, and in these cases, it's the average person, the average American, the common American, who knows better than the leading officers and better than the officials and better than the government about knowing about what exactly needs to be done and accomplished. Like, for example, to defeat Ferguson, he knew that, time was of the essence. There was no time to wait for the government to send orders to do anything. They knew they had to do it themselves. So basically, they called an assembly at Sycamore Shoals, and this was along a well-known meeting place on the other side, on the west side of the mountains, and they met. Basically, the average guy, he grabbed his best horse and his best long rifle, and they all assembled, and they knew what had to be done, and so they crossed the mountains and rode several hundred miles in order to catch Ferguson's force before he could retreat to join Cornwallis's main army at Charlotte, North Carolina. Time was of the essence. They had to rely on their own abilities, their own firearms, and they turned the course of the American Revolution in consequence by basically just the common people, the average man on the frontier, rising up and doing what he knew had to be done. And it was a real simple motivation, was to protect home and families, because Ferguson had already threatened them with by saying he would cross over the mountains and hang the Patriot leaders and burn their settlements. And by this time, they were the men across the mountains, west side of the mountains, were experienced Indian fighters. They had already defeated the Cherokee, and they knew that the key to survival on the frontier was striking first. Therefore, their preemptive strike was all important, and from what they had learned in years and years of fighting the Cherokee and the Creek to a lesser extent, that they had to be proactive and join together and cross the mountains and defeat this Ferguson. And again, this was largely a Scotch-Irish victory, where it's just incredible that the majority of the soldiers were Celtic, and they knew from Indian warfare and also from their experiences in Ireland and Scotland that if any threat was posed, you better meet it real quick, or you can expect the worst. So history really helped them, the Celtic people, on both the east and west side of the mountain for this turning point victory. But
gotcha. So we have a good sense of the initiative, the skill and the initiative of these fighters and how essential they were. We have a good sense that in every battle in every colony, when the British did capture Revolutionary War troops, they were always surprised how many of them were Gaelic speakers. You mentioned Montgomery. Can you talk about the other essential Irish-born generals, the fighting generals that really, when people hear this list, they're going to be amazing, because it's almost like every important general in that whole army was Irish.
Yeah, there's a connection. For example, like Anthony Wayne, they called him Mad Anthony Wayne, not because of his mental state, but because of his fighting prowess, and he led elite Pennsylvania Continental troops, and they were like the very foundation of Washington's army. And what is forgotten about them is that there were so many Irish in the ranks of the Continental line of Pennsylvania that they were called the Line of Ireland, which of course reveals the demographic background, but also reveals the fighting prowess of these troops, because they were Washington's crack soldiers. Another forgotten Ireland-born officer is the very father of the United States Navy, John Barry. He played a key role in first organizing and setting up the United States Navy, and of course, it was not only generals, but we had a lot of the leading politicians at the time, from agitators to officials during the war who were born in Ireland. And so the Irish are making not only key military roles, but also contributing politically and economically. For example, in order to supply the mostly Scotch-Irish on the Kings Mountain expedition. It was an Ireland-born official of western North Carolina, or today's East Tennessee, who donated the funds. He had no authorization to do so, but he was a tax collector, and he contributed the crucial funds for the expedition. While a Scotch-Irish woman played the key role in creating the black powder for the soldiers of the expedition. And of course, probably the most famous Scotch-Irish general may well have been Daniel Morgan. He was a frontiersman from Virginia. He also had experience in the French and Indian War. He was with Montgomery on the attack on Quebec in late 1775, but he's most famous for his tactical victory at the Cowpens, South Carolina. This was in mid-January 1781. He created a brilliant set of tactics that prevailed in the battle. It's a rather remarkable story. He's well known.
There's one that I really love, and I was so shocked to realize that this guy was Irish, because he's always been one of my heroes, which is Knox. Yeah,
that's a good point. General Henry Knox. He's the right-hand man of Washington, not only, like, for example, supervising the crossing of the Delaware River on the way to scoring a great victory against the German Hessians at Trenton on December 26, 1776. But he also was the longtime commander of Washington's artillery arm, and he performed brilliantly from the war's beginning to all the way to the end, all the way to Yorktown. And
well, the amazing thing, I think, the thing that always stuck out for me is this is the guy that was responsible for the liberation of Boston. He's the one that dragged all those cannon from Ticonderoga to the hills of Boston and drove the British out. And it's an irony, and maybe we should double back and talk about this issue. Clearly, it's not Irish Celtic people writing the history, because you would think that it was Virginia planters and New England yeoman farmers who did everything.
Right. Well, yeah, and that's excellent. That's a very good point. We've talked about how the Scotch-Irish has been forgotten, and one of the reasons why I mentioned, northern writers, especially in the Northeast, especially New England, because they created their own myth that it was largely New Englanders who played the leading roles in winning the war, and rather than the Scotch-Irish.
Well, isn't there also a heavy infiltration of Anglophiles in the academic? Well, I don't know how it is today, but certainly up until this current era, it's been pretty much controlled by Anglophilic people who, I'll tell you this, you might find this interesting, Philip. I went to a school that is very identified with Irish Catholicism, Regis High School in Manhattan. And in fact, it was endowed by an Irish Catholic. It's a private school, and anybody that gets in can go for free. And it's always been Irish Catholics have always been hugely represented at this Irish Catholic school. So I didn't learn anything about Irish history until I was long out of high school, long out of college. I was kind of interested. I was interested in history. I would have been receptive if someone had told the stories. And we even had an American history professor. The school was very hard, by the way. In fact, when I went to college, I thought college was a joke compared to the high school I went to. It was so rigorous. But we had I'm going to call him a professor, John Connolly.
Sounds like you had a few priests in charge.
Yeah. Just to give you an example of how rough it was, you had a choice. You could do 3 years of Latin or 3 years of Greek. That was your choice.
Wow.
Yeah.
Wow.
It was heavy duty. It was heavy duty.
Like it. Definitely.
Out of a class of 100, they routinely put 5 in Harvard, 5 in Princeton, 5 in Yale,
Wow.
20 in Columbia. Yeah, I mean, it's all heavyweight. But here's my point.
That's-
So we had a professor, which I'll call him a professor, John Connolly, very nice man, very intelligent man, obviously Irish American. We talked about everything. We talked about Machiavelli. We talked about you name it. The idea that Ireland was fighting for its life against a rapacious British Empire never crossed the lips of any historian at this densely Irish Catholic school. How is that possible?
Yeah,
I ask myself.
Well, it's not politically correct. It's not fashionable. Ironically, that same attitude existed at the time of the American Revolution, for example. And this was another reason why the men of Kings Mountain weren't written about. You look at the quotes of officers, British officers like Ferguson. Ironically, he was born in Scotland, but of course he served the British Army. The words that they used for the Scotch-Irish, which were just the common people on the frontier, he called them the dregs of mankind. And, better yet, he called them mongrels. They were considered at that time, today racial theory and proponents are popular today, of course, but we forget that at that time, and even somewhat today, which alludes to your point to a degree, the Irish were looked at not only as a separate race, but a degenerative race and the lowest race. And this was widely accepted, ironically, not only by British leadership. Of course, they were members of the British aristocracy, so that attitude could be expected because they'd look down on Americans in general because they were provincials or born in America. But their greatest animosity was directed toward the Scotch-Irish and other Celtic settlers like the Welsh. And they just saw them. They looked at the American experience on the frontier as not like popular American writers have looked at it, like Frederick Jackson Turner, in terms of fostering freedom and democracy and what have you. They looked at it from the opposite point of view, that what was going on in the frontier was a degeneration of civilization, and that the Scotch-Irish were, wallowing in debauchery, basically. But in truth, it was the exact opposite, because one of the keys to their survival, and this in part explains the victory at Kings Mountain among the common Scotch-Irish people, was that they might well have been the most religious and devout people in America. Living on the frontier, facing Native American threats constantly, and daily survival naturally engendered a closeness to God. You needed some help.
Hey, right.
What better than the highest authority? For example, like right before they took the Kings Mountain men rode off to defeat Ferguson, Samuel Dunk, he was also a Scotch-Irishman, of course. He gave a benediction to the gathered more than 1,000 frontiersmen and from both sides of the mountain, and implored to them, use Old Testament biblical lessons to instill them with the proper moral faith and righteousness, that this was a holy war and the cause was sacred. And so they actually might have been the most religious people in America out of necessity, but also they had learned, of course, in Ireland and on the other side of the Atlantic to you better rely on God as much as possible, because He might be the only person on your side. And that didn't change. That was only intensified with the frontier experience because of the many dangers. So it's just another strange irony that attitude that you saw in the American Revolution and before, with not only the British upper class, but also the upper class of Americans, who looked down upon the frontier people, the Scotch-Irish mainly, as uncivilized. They even accused them of becoming more Indian than Indian. Now, they did adopt, of course, at that time, Indians were considered the lowest, the most lowest form of civilization, or what have you. So they saw the Scotch-Irish as descending to that. Now, to be fair, the Scotch-Irish did adapt some Native American ways, but of course they were in the positive. Even some of their equipment, like the tomahawk and stuff like this. And most importantly, Indian ways of war fighting, which was what won the victory at Kings Mountain. So they had learned their lessons well. So what I'm saying is that attitude, it's been historically anti-Irish and anti-Scotch-Irish. It existed as much in the American Revolution as it does in modern times, which is a strange development. It's even somewhat worse in today, where Scotch-Irish and people of the frontier are looked at today as just basically backward crackers, quote unquote. What's interesting in some of the work I've done is the word cracker was commonly used by the British during the American Revolution in the South for the Scotch-Irish and the frontier people. So, today that's a dirty word, and it was always meant to be. I'm not going to say it was as bad as the N-word, of course, but it somewhat had the same serious negative connotations. And
well,
it's interesting. It's a stereotype, of course, but it's a stereotype that is stuck, and it's almost as popular today as it was in the American Revolution, and that's one reason why the Northeastern elite historians and the intellectuals have always, not always, I should say, but most often have focused on American Revolutionary events and leaders, not in the South, especially in the area of the Middle States and especially New England, at the expense of the South, because who the heck wants to write about Southern crackers, right? So,
well, it seems to be the only ethnic group that it's acceptable to disparage and revile.
Yeah, that's
like there's no consequence at all. You can say anything you want.
Yeah, and the amazing thing about that it's continued all for hundreds and hundreds of years. I mean, it's the same attitude of. That's why that motivated in part why the British obtained their first colony, which was Ireland, through brutal conquest. They looked at the Irish as subhuman in much the same way as the Nazis looked at the Jewish people in World War II. And you can see the writings of English conquerors of Ireland and Scotland, and that's one reason why they were so ruthless to the Celtic people, is that they were considered non-human. And so you could almost do anything, and you even see that with Thomas Nash. Nash, in the 20th century, his cartoons about the Irish in leading newspapers, like in New York, and he has the Irish looking like apes. Their faces, their facial features are ape-like, and even their physical forms with long arms. And this is in the 20th century, but of course that's at a time where no Irish allowed signs are posted.
Sure.
It's just amazing how they were just considered, and it was an accepted stereotype that, well, that's how Irish people look. It looked like something from the movie Planet of the Apes almost.
Yeah, I've seen the cartoons, and it's always the forerunner to some kind of systematic abuse to disparage the victims. Hey, let's switch gears. If you wouldn't mind, we've talked a lot about the Scots-Irish in America, and people might think, well, that's all that Philip's interested in. It's very interesting, but however, you've also written some amazing books about the Haitian Revolution, and the Haitians are also treated, and their great revolutionary spirit.
That's a great point.
Also
That's a very good point. I've never had anyone make that appropriate analogy, and that's a very good one.
Really? And my goodness, I'm glad to be the first, but I hope there'll be many more.
That's very impressive. Yeah, you're right. Maybe one of the biggest ironies is that there is so many commonalities between the two people. Of course, in the case of Haiti, I've written, you mentioned, and thanks for mentioning that, I've written several books on leading Haitian revolutionary women. And they're the first books ever about them, so it was really fun to do. But again, the parallels between the Irish and the Haitians are really almost endless. Of course, the Haitians were punished because of what they accomplished. They were successful at a time when blacks were considered subhuman, just like the British upper class and American upper class looked at the Irish. The sin of the Haitians that they're still paying for today, which in part explains why they're generally considered the poorest nation in the Western Hemisphere, why their history has been so turbulent, poverty so deep, was because they did the unthinkable. They overturned and defeated the pro-slavery French forces of Napoleon, and were the first black people to create their own independent nation and republic when they defeated the French and declared the independence of the Republic of Haiti on January 1st, 1804. And, of course, that you could not have done anything worse to upset the powers to be, especially England, which was the leader of the slave market at that time, the slave mercantilism, and also the United States, of course, which was also a slave nation, and everybody else except the Haitians. So basically, the Western powers, dealt with what they perceived as the threat of slaves liberating each other and establishing their own nation by basically blackballing, if you will, Haiti. And France put a huge reparation loan they had to pay back. The Haitians had to pay back. That kept accruing interest, and I don't think it didn't get paid off. I don't believe until the 1940s, if I'm not mistaken. And so that guaranteed just decades and decades and decades impoverishment and no development. Again, Haiti has a great deal of potential in its land and resources, but there's never been Western developers, there's never been Western money, there's not been a Western initiative to develop Haiti and to make it prosperous like they've done to other countries, in part because of their great sin of having overthrown slavery and defeated the French, which was unheard of at that time. Again, it's the first time in history that black people accomplished this and created their own republic. And an amazing story. And they've had to pay a heavy price for what they accomplished, and it still continues to this day in the form of the nation's impoverishment.
I mean, it's not even
revolutionary heritage. They accomplished what the Irish never did in terms of freeing their own homeland against British rule, but the Haitians did it, of course, against Napoleon's French, and these were some of the best troops, conquerors of Europe. And it was a long and bloody revolution, but they succeeded in the end. And
I hadn't made the connection that, of course, I knew the French were involved, but it didn't occur to me that, of course, the English would have, the British Empire would have been too, because they were the leaders of the global slave trade, and so disrupting Haiti and that, which was just an unbelievably important cog in the wheel, the slave trade.
Everybody, all the Western powers, the imperialist powers on both sides of the Atlantic, were more than happy to agree with each other in terms of keeping the Haitians down, again, because of this revolutionary threat that, especially in the American South, of course, the planters feared the example of Haiti, and even some of the slave revolts in America, one of the most famous, one in 1811 right north of New Orleans, Louisiana, that was led by Haitians who had experienced and learned about the meaning of freedom in their own independent struggle. So there was a threat, and it was severe enough that they just came down hard on Haiti, and it's never recovered to this day.
Now that's an interesting story about. Sorry to interrupt, but that's an interesting story about New Orleans. I know you don't need any more book ideas, but in the event you ever did, if in the event you ever did, that would be a fascinating story, because I don't think that's understood at all. I mean, people vaguely have a sense that there was some kind of, quote, French influence on New Orleans, but what they don't really understand is a lot of that was Franco-Haitian influence.
Oh yeah. Well, for example, like the great victory of Andrew Jackson at the Battle of New Orleans. Well, some of his best trained men were not the stereotypical United States regulars, but there was a couple battalions of free men of color from Saint-Domingue, that was the name of the French colony before it became Haiti, of course. And they played a key role in the battle in terms of and merchants, Haitian merchants played a key role in supplying Jackson's army and supplying the manpower, supplying guns, ammunition, even the story of Jean Lafitte, the famous Caribbean pirate. He was born in Saint-Domingue, and he went through. He knew what it was like, the slave revolt days, and he was more than happy to have an opportunity to strike back at the British Army. So he supplied men, weapons, cannon. He also remembered from the Haitian Revolution that the English invaded Haiti, or Saint-Domingue at that time, and with the goal of hoping to secure the colony for themselves from the French. So he had some ugly reminders of the British, and that, like other Haitian people of New Orleans, who saw it naturally ideal when the opportunity came to unite together and join up with Jackson in order to face the British at the Battle of New Orleans in January 1850.
Well, I've spent a lot of time in New Orleans, and I can't say that I've been a serious historian, but I do absorb what the common memes are, that are in people's minds. And right. I guarantee the average New Orleanian, even somebody that knows New Orleans history, including African Americans, is not aware of the important role that free men of color played in defending New Orleans against the British. I think that's another missing story.
Yeah, you're right. That's a good point. And again, it's missing in part because of the so-called sin of the Haitians, which was to overthrow the French. Well, that automatically guaranteed that riders would not be focusing on Haitians, including the United States, the ones that migrated from Haiti, and more settled in New Orleans than any other place. Quite a few settled in Charleston and other southern port cities like Mobile, Alabama. But it's all part of the silencing of Haitian history because of that slave revolt, the world's most successful one and the world's largest one at the time, that began in 1791, that initiated the struggle for Haitian independence. That's just a guarantee why the story of the Haitians have been forgotten here in the U.S. Like I said, the Battle of New Orleans was key because they had their own plan of established like Napoleon. Before them, ironically, they had their own plan of after they captured New Orleans to extend their gains north up the Mississippi and maybe conquer the entire Mississippi Valley, which would hem in the United States, east of Mississippi, and that would end the dream of westward expansion to the Pacific, which could have been potentially an event that changed the course of world history.
Well, also related to that is the fact that the Haitians defeated the French in Haiti is what forced the sale of Louisiana. Well, what they called Louisiana, which is actually the entire center of the United States. From
that's a good point, because, like I mentioned, but not in detail, Napoleon had his own vision of a new world empire, and that was based on New Orleans, moving north up the Mississippi and conquering the American heartland. And of course, this was the region that the French had originally settled. We forget this too. Before the American Revolution, they had, of course, all of Canada, and they had all the area all the way down to New Orleans. Now, the real small settlements of Frenchmen like at Vincennes and not Vincennes, but Kaskaskia, Illinois, on the Mississippi, and other towns like Cahokia, Illinois. But basically, that was all French domain, and Napoleon wanted to reconquer that, because it was lost, of course, when the British won the French and Indian War, or the 7 Years' War, as it is known in Europe. So there was a lot at stake, and we have forgotten that the Haitians played a big role at the Battle of New Orleans, which was a turning point in terms of American history and westward expansion. And
if the British had taken hold of New Orleans and really reinforced it, it would have been very hard to get them out of there, and they would have controlled the Mississippi.
Because at that time we forget too that they were the world's largest naval power, so they could have easily defended it, because of course the Mississippi is wide enough that ocean-going vessels can easily navigate to New Orleans and even further up the river. So it was a very serious threat, and the forgotten players again were these Haitians. That they had a very viable, very active French-speaking population, and they donated at least 2 battalions of freemen of color, and they played a vital role in saving the day at New Orleans when quite a bit was at stake.
Well, so much to talk about. We've been talking with Philip Thomas Tucker about all kinds of things. I strongly recommend that you go to his website, which you can find, phyllis-thomas-tucker-phd.com. If you want to see all his books, they're all up on Amazon, and there's a lot. And we've only scratched the surface. There's a lot more to talk about. But the theme,
I appreciate it.
The theme for me seems to be, there's this thing called history, but it may not be the whole story, and not unsurprisingly, it's being filtered, and it's being filtered in a very predictable way. So, Philip Thomas Tucker, thanks for shining a light on the other part of the story that seems to have been lost every step of the way. And we look forward to more of your books, and we'll let people know when your new books are coming out.
Okay, thank you, sir. I appreciate it. It was really fun. Take care.
Thank you.